Hola y bienvenido. Hello and welcome to Thursdays for the Soul on this day, March 31st, the last day of March of 2022. And this is the 150th program of the Thursdays for the Soul series of the United Church of Christ. Thursdays for the Soul is a webinar series for the whole church. We faithfully focus on care and education for the people of God and create opportunities to digitally worship together as the whole of the United Church of Christ. From prayer, music, and psalms to interviews of key leaders and how-tos in congregational life. This series stays current to the relevant topics of the time and offers opportunities of connections in the wider church and in your community. Together, we bring our church and the world towards the world God imagines for all of us. Buen dia. I am Reverend Roberto Ochoa, the Associate for Congregations of Color and Ethnic Identified Congregations within the Justice and Local Church Ministries of the United Church of Christ, and your host and moderator for your program today. In presenting this program, we are aware of the global backdrop which is playing out at this very moment. We lift our hearts and prayers to the people of the nation of Ukraine as they fight to keep their liberty from an aggressive force. We lift up other parts of the world impacted by civil wars and foreign aggressions, like in Yemen, Syria, and Palestine. In the U.S., we lift up our communities devastated by the current tornadoes and severe storms, many in our rural and small town communities. We lift up the world today, praying for peace and justice for all of God's creation. Gracias for joining us for this hour of hope and faith. We are so pleased to present today a conversation with Calvin Synod Conference of the United Church of Christ. We have a superb panel joining us today. But before we get to today's session, let me tell you about what we have coming up next in our series. Next week on Thursday, April 7th, we present Make Visible. Come join Thursdays for the Soul, showcasing ministries and leadership, amplifying our trans preachers in the United Church of Christ. Transgender people are beloved of God, called into ministry, and changing the world for the better every day. Come and worship with us featuring Reverend Louis Mitchell, Pastor Renee Slattepier, Reverend Jamie Lee Sprague-Ballio, and the music of Reverend Tracy Howe. It will be an inspirational hour for sure. And on Thursday, April 14th, which will be Maundy Thursday, we commemorate the day of which Jesus Christ shared a meal, prayed, and was taken to trial before he was crucified. Members of the national staff will lead worship, offering prayers, and inviting Holy Communion from wherever we are. And wherever we are, have those sacred supplies to participate in communion as you feel comfortable. Join us as we partake in the holiest week of our Christian faith. As usual, you can visit ucc.org or any of our social media platforms to find out about upcoming sessions like these. All our Thursdays for the Soul digital programs begin at 9:30 a.m. Hawaii, aloha, 12:30 p.m. Pacific, 1:30 Mountain, 2:30 Central, and 3:30 p.m. Eastern times. And if these hours inspire you in any way, would you like to continue support and you would like to consider supporting ministries like these, consider donating to the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. That's UCC to 41444. Now, for our program today. The Calvin Synod Conference of the United Church of Christ is the only non-geographical and ethnic identified conference in the denomination. I am pleased and honored to have with us today the Reverend Viktor Toth, who is the General Secretary of Calvin Synod, and Elder James Ballas, member of the United Church of Christ in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and an Honorary Presbyter of the Calvin Synod, who are joining us today. So, how are you doing there, Reverend Viktor Toth?
Hi, and thank you. I am very well. I am in California, It's raining right now, but that's good when it's raining here.
Well, welcome so much. And how are you today, Elder James?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm doing okay today. Good to
Well,
be with you.
thank you for being with us today. So today we will discuss the rich heritage and history of the Hungarian Magyar people of the people. We will discuss their history, the Evangelical Reform movement in Hungary and in the U.S. And we also will explore the Magyar Synod's role in the formation of the UCC and the outlook for UCC's ethnic identified Hungarian congregations in the United Church of Christ. I believe this will prove to be a very illuminating and enriching hour for all of us and anyone interested in the ethnic and congregations of color that make up the full spectrum of the UCC and the wider church. Earlier this month, Reverend Viktor, Elder Jim, and I gathered to have an initial conversation on Calvin Synod, which we recorded. And we wanted to open up today's program with that recording. Then we'll be back to continue the conversation where we left off, to offer our reflections of our conversations, and perhaps answer some questions. Enjoy. Jennifer? Well, hello. With me today, I have Reverend Viktor Towell, who is the General Secretary of Calvin Synod. Hello, Reverend Viktor. How you doing?
Good, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for being with us. And then also with us is the Elder James Ballas, who's the Honorary Synod Presbyter and a member of the United Church of Christ in Bridgeport, right?
Correct.
Well, thank you both for being with us today. I'm so excited that, we have this conversation with Calvin Synod Conference, which is the United Church of Christ's only ethnic identified conference and also non-geographical conference that is part of the United Church of Christ. So thank you, welcome for your time. Thank you for your time. And the first question is, can you tell us a little bit, Reverend Viktor, about the history of the Hungarian people and the culture and traditions?
Yes, so we just celebrated our first millennial. Hungary is more than 1,000 years old now in the Carpathian Basin. And it's right in the middle of Europe. As a matter of fact, there is a village in Hungary in which there is a stone and it says, this is the geographical center of the European continent. And it is important for the Hungarian ethnicity because we speak a very different language than any other European countries. So Hungarian is a non-Indo-European language, one of the three in Europe, which always put us into a kind of island mindset. We feel like we are an island within Europe. And first, Hungary was Roman Catholic, of course, but then when the Reformation came, Hungary almost 100% became Protestant. As a matter of fact, the first writing document about Protestantism is from 1519. So if you think about it, it started in 1517 and already in 1519 Reformation was in Hungary. And that was the time when the Turkish occupation happened. So it was a place and time when Reformation was able to spread faster because the Catholic countries became, and actually I'm talking about the Habsburgs, the Habsburg Empire became weaker. So Hungary became Protestant, but when the Turkish were defeated by the Habsburgs, and the Habsburg has very tight Roman Catholic faith, a very severe persecution started, which basically recatalyzed the country except the eastern part, which is right now, if you look at the news because of Ukraine, that's actually on the eastern border of Hungary. We have a shared border with Ukraine and Romania, and Transylvania at that time was part of the Hungarian kingdom. So all of that eastern part of Hungary remained Protestant. They had to fight for it. They had to fight for like 100 years And that's, again, a very important part of the Hungarian Reformed spirit, that first of all, we are isolated, and we were always isolated. We always felt that way. Second, we had to fight for our religious freedom 500 years ago. So we have these kind of very deep roots about religious freedom and our faith. And Hungarian Reformation came to the United States at the end of the 19th century, where coal mines were started to spread, especially in Pennsylvania and Ohio. And it is estimated that 700,000 Hungarians came in 50 years at the end of the 19th century. And what is important, most of the population came from the eastern part of Hungary because it was mostly agricultural. And at that time it was a famine. So people didn't have work. They were practically dying because they didn't have enough food. So a massive amount of Reformed people came to the US. And because of our faith and because of our isolationist mindset, the first thing they did were basically building churches. Even before they built their own houses, they got together, they built a Reformed church, they imported a Reformed pastor. It was also very important that the faith had to be spread in Hungarian by a Hungarian Reformed minister. And you can imagine like 500,000 people was able to establish a very strong root for Hungarian Reformation in that part of the United States. Again, it's the East Coast, mostly Pennsylvania and Ohio. And after the First World War, Hungary was one of the defeated countries, and we were punished severely. So Hungary became a poor country, and the Hungarian Reformed Church in Hungary didn't have enough money to support the Hungarian missions in America. So at that point, the Hungarian Reformed Church in America joined to the German Reformed Church because the Germans, I guess, still had enough money to support us. And then a second wave came at the end of the Second World War, when the Russians started to occupy the eastern part of Europe. Tens of thousands of Hungarians came to the US, and the first place they went was the Hungarian Reformed Church. It was already established. They could speak their own language. And even if they were Catholic at that time, now Catholics were coming also, they actually joined to the Hungarian Reformed Church because that was the ethnic church in which. And then a third wave came after the 1956 revolution, which was severely punished by the Russians. Tens of thousands of people came to the US. And again, the first place they went were the Hungarian Reformed Church. And at that time, the Hungarian Reformed churches were so established, they actually were able to sponsor people to come to the US and settle down.
So Jim, Elder James, so how did the development of the Hungarian Reform and the German Reform, how did that come about to the relationship and helping with the formation of the United Church of Christ?
Yes, so as picking up to where Viktor is and going back just a tad bit, in the 1934, the Evangelical Church merged with the Reformed Church in the United States, so became the ENR Church, which the Hungarians were part of. And in 1939, March 14th, actually, the Magyar Synod was formed within the ENR Church. Now, at the time, the ENR Church was primarily made up of geographical synods, as they were called at that time. But the Hungarians, Magyar meaning Hungarian people, the Hungarians were allowed to form their own non-geographical synod, which was called the Magyar Synod. So that's where the foundation comes from, that back in those days, our synod was formed. As immigration continued, many, of course, mixed within the United States, and English became a primary language for a lot of congregations. As Viktor mentioned, the mission was to preach to the Hungarian speaking population, but as more and more English the churches became more English and providing English services. In 1957, when the ENR Church merged with the Christian Congregational churches to form the United Church of Christ, June 25th, 1957. And of course, at that time, all the geographical synods were to be to be maintained as geographical conferences within the United Church of Christ. The Fourth General Synod of the United Church of Christ on July of 1963 allowed one exception, and until their own action of reorganization, synods may act as a conference within the United Church of Christ. The basis of union gave them the right to unite without breaking their respective historic continuities and traditions. So with that action, the Magyar Synod at that time formed their own constitution and bylaws and became a conference in the United Church of Christ. Now, many of our congregations still conduct both English and Hungarian services because there is still some immigration, and there is a need for that. But a lot of them also made the conversion to English. And I just wanted to share with you a paragraph from the history booklet of Calvin Synod that talks about this immigration and Americanization. It's, we do not want integration or Americanization, which can be neither hindered nor accelerated. To be a primary concern in this process, this union, when witnessing Christ should be the first undisputed place in his church. We honestly endeavor to be a color in the rainbow of the United Church of Christ within the framework of the Magyar Synod, rather than be an unwilling material and ecclesiastic melting pot without Magyar Synod. So as our congregations assimilate, as it may be to some respect, they still preserve their Hungarian culture and traditions. And we have our gifts of ethnic folk art, music, dance, and of course, food that's still alive in many congregations. One of the struggles, of course, with an ethnic church is how to maintain and keep your heritage and tradition, but to strive to witness to the gospel and be true to Jesus Christ. And in many cases, it can be a challenge and a struggle as we go forward. And we could talk more about this as we go.
So thank you so much for that. So what is it that it was so important for members of Calvin Synod to hold on to the Hungarian ethnicity, especially during a period, that in the 50s and the 60s, 70s, the call for assimilation and acculturation was the norm here in the United States?
Yeah, so just like Jim said, we feel that we have, this is not a negative thing. This is a positive thing. We are not against something. We are for something. And our connection with the Hungarian Reformed churches, or now I would say the Hungarian Reformed churches in the Carpathian Basin, was always very close. And so, for example, our two most important theological books are the Second Helvetic Confession and now I don't remember the
Heidelberg Catechism.
Thank you, the Heidelberg Catechism. This is why we have presbyters. Thank you so much. And this is a little bit different because American Protestantism is more linked to Puritanism, which is almost unknown for us, for Hungarians, or the Hungarian Reformed churches. And just like I said, because we are very old, more than 5,000 or 5,000 years old, we feel like this is something which we need to carry on. And because of historical facts, now we can say that living outside of the borders of Hungary is a kind of shared experience with 1/3 of the Hungarian population, because 1/3 of the Hungarian ethnic people are outside of the Hungarian border. So for us, this is not something alien. This is not something new. This is not something that we are figuring out in the US. We Hungarians feel that it was and it is always going to be part of the immigrant experience, is always going to be part of the wider Hungarian experience.
Awesome. So a couple of questions that I'm curious about. As you know, in the United Church of Christ, we consider ourselves a flat hierarchical form of governance. In the Calvin Synod, so we don't have bishops, but Calvin Synod, you all have bishops. So I'm curious about how the bishop system works, or how the leadership of the governance of Calvin Synod works, as well as how do congregations do a search and call? How do they receive pastoral leadership?
So maybe I can cover the bishop and then Jim can talk about the calling. So that's, again, having a bishop is a historical fact. And there are actually different ideas why Hungarian Reforms have bishops. I think actually our closest relative is the Dutch Reformed Church. And for many hundreds of years, they also had bishops. I don't know at this point they have bishops or not. Now that is actually a very interesting thing for us, because in Hungary, bishops are elected for a lifetime. But in the Calvin Synod, we only elect a bishop. Well, we used to elect a bishop for 3 years, and now we elect a bishop for 4 years, and then it can be renewed one time. So now we can have a bishop for 8 years, which means it's more a kind of chairman position, basically, that the bishop is the chairman of the Bishops' Council. And I would say he doesn't have too much power. Our bishops are usually spending most of their energies really helping out churches, especially our current bishop, Dr. Krasnai. He puts a lot of energy on going to churches which are weakened or dying out and trying to reorganize them. His doctorate is from that direction. So for us, bishops are basically the thing which was in the Bible, an overseer, a kind of pastor of pastors, who is pastoring the pastors, who is overseeing the churches and help when help is needed. The bishop has no power to kick out a pastor if he doesn't like it, or nothing like that. So it's more like a kind of chairman position.
And I would add to that, first of all, historical perspective, that when we were Magyar Synod, before United Church of Christ came in, the bishop was called the president of the synod. It was not the bishop. The title was, you were the president of the synod, and that was the minister who was now the bishop. What we discovered, I think part of the issue was when that person went to Hungary or in Europe to represent us, he was sitting at a table with the bishops or hierarchy of the churches there, and many times was not given a seat at that table because his title was president. He wasn't a bishop. So he was shunned away from being active in the actual leadership of the worldwide church. So in order to remedy that, one of the things that Calvin Synod actually voted to do was to change the title of the president to the bishop, so he can participate and be included in the worldwide church, especially the Reformed Church in Hungary, which uses the titles of bishop. Viktor is absolutely correct that bishop, although he has some authority, in essence, he is a conference minister, like in the United Church of Christ. That's what he is. We have what's called the Conference Council, which is a group of elder officers of the church, similar to the structure in the United Church of Christ, that carries out the duties. And actually, just as in the United Church of Christ, the power comes from our congregations. The local congregation has the authority and the power to make all their own decisions. The synod is there to assist, to help, to guide, to provide a structure, and be there. But basically, we have the congregations decide. In the Reformed tradition, the governance is not, although in some respects, I think we're more congregational than the actual congregational churches are, because the people have a lot to say when it comes to making the decisions of our church. But in our system of governance, we elect elders, which is a consistory that actually is like a board of directors that makes the decisions in the church. And from that, also each church elects delegates, just like United Church of Christ and General Synod, that comes to our conference. Used to be annual, but now it's every 2 years that we meet, and that's when the decisions are made, all by vote of the delegates. And that's how all our actions are decided. And so it's a reformed type of process, but it has a much strong congregational presence. One thing I might add too about historical with Hungary and the Reformed Church, the churches are always in partnership between the clergy and the members of the laity. And if you look at the history of the Reformed Church in Hungary, it's always the pastor and the chief elder, which is the lay leader elected from the congregation, that are in partnership to make the decisions and run the actual operations of the church. Many of our bylaws reflect this. You will see that all of this, the operational decisions are partnership of the pastorate and the chief elders. So the laity and the pastors have a partnership working together in the Reformed tradition to operate the daily operations of the congregations.
Great. And how do congregations call their pastoral leaders? Where do they go to a regular search and call process that's commonly used in the denomination, United Church of Christ? Do the pastors have to be able to speak Hungarian or be bilingual? And is there good pastoral training? So how does a Calvin Synod congregation find their pastoral leadership?
Would you like me to handle? Okay, so basically the congregation is the decider. They, just as in United Church of Christ, the congregation has the full right and authority to elect their own pastor. We do have a church and ministry committee, which is similar to, actually, Calvin Synod also acts as an association in the United Church of Christ. So in that role, we have the church and ministry committee, which is the placement committee for ministers. So they would evaluate, they would provide candidates. We do follow United Church of Christ guidelines. So our ministers are required to fill out the profile that the United Church of Christ uses. The congregations also fill out the church profile that the United Church of Christ provides for us. And when we're seeking a candidate now, and those candidates can be found from many sources. As the question as to language, no, it is not a requirement that they must speak Hungarian. They could speak any languages that are needed for the congregation. Basically, it comes down to what is the need of that congregation. So if it is a congregation that still conducts a Hungarian service and the congregation would like a Hungarian speaking pastor, then obviously the pool comes from Hungary many times, or from Americanized Hungarian-speaking candidates that are out there. The congregation does not have a Hungarian service, then obviously they seek any English-speaking candidate that could come from even within the United Church of Christ. So, and that is the advantage that we are part of the United Church of Christ, that if we have a minister that comes from within that, it's a much easier process, because most of the time they have also gone through the procedure of the United Church of Christ. We do sometimes get ministers from other denominations, such as Presbyterian, but they have to go through a process and that is spelled out in our bylaws. And in some cases, they have more to do in order to qualify and become, or they can become a dual minister and keep standing in Presbyterian and serve one of our churches, which has its own rules and regulations.
And here where, again, we can talk about the bishop, because in the Hungarian Reform tradition, the bishop has the power to ordain ministers. So for example, in my case, although I had seminary education on college level in Hungary, when I came to America, I received my Master's of Divinity here in America. But because I went through the process, Jim explained, I was ordained by the bishop of the Calvin Synod as a Hungarian Reformed minister. And I don't know if you ever have seen the Ballas, which is the robe the Hungarian Reformed ministers are having on. It's a kind of link to the Swiss Reformation, because that's the traditional robe given in Geneva by the seminary, which was founded by John Calvin. We are also called Calvinists. Actually, in Hungary, we are called the Calvinist Church because we belong to the Calvinist tradition. And again, this is very, very important for us traditionally. And we have two sacraments, which is the baptism and the Lord's Supper, and only ordained ministers, Hungarian Reformed ordained ministers, can traditionally serve the Lord's Supper and baptism. Now, in recent years, we had to make changes and we give power. But again, it's like the bishop's council working with the Church and Ministry Committee with to authorize other people or other ministers to minister, for example, the Lord's Supper. But the basic way is a Hungarian Reformed minister, ordained Reformed minister, only have the power to minister the Lord's Supper and baptism. And in some of our churches, I would say it's still like 50 or more percent church. They want to have somebody with the robe, with the Genevan robe on, to minister the Lord's Supper. And it is important for them ethnically. It's actually not like a kind of theological question. It's a very important Hungarian ethnic question.
And speaking about that, thank you for that. And so in relationship to the wider Church of the United Church of Christ, where is the current state of the Calvin Synod congregations theologically, and what do you think the future is like? Jim?
The future is a difficult question, because obviously the past 2 years, many things have changed. And in one respect, the traditions that we hold on to were rocked because of it, frankly. And Viktor mentioned the communion, and that's one of the things. And I don't know if he knew, but the tradition, one of our traditions of handing the actual bread and wine from the minister's hand to each member Similar, I guess, to the Catholic Church, where the priest, hands the wafer, probably where it came from. But that tradition also comes from the Heidelberg, not the Second Helvetic Confession, which states that it comes from the hand. One of the quotes, the hand of the minister. So in many of our churches, the tradition was that the minister hands you the bread and the wine during the communion service. That, of course, went on its heels during COVID, because we had to do away with some of those really historic traditions that many of our churches did. And for some, it was difficult because we also had a common cup for communion for many congregations, and that also had to be put to the side as many, the COVID protocols and things came in. How to serve a communion safely, and basically when you have 100 years of tradition of how to do it. So that a lot of those things rocked our future. Our future, I think, is very similar to that of many congregations in the United Church of Christ. Mainline Protestant, as everyone knows, is in decline, and our struggle to maintain what we have and how to build on it is always a daily challenge for all of us. Calvin Synod is no different. We have shrinking congregations, we have older populations, I think that our future is definitely tied to the future of the United Church of Christ, that we want to be partnership with a wider church body, and not only in the US, but throughout the world. That's why we maintain our ties to the Reformed Church in Hungary, and because we all need to face these issues together going forward. I think there's a lot of issues that we need to work on together, and I think Calvin Synod, as well as United Church of Christ, needs to do all these things together as one church, as our founding fathers wanted us to do, that they may all be one. I see that as our future. Whether, this question as to whether we would assimilate into the geographic conferences has been a question for probably 30 years going back. And eventually that probably would be the direction, but the membership has to be ready to force members to do that. To me, would only be a divisive thing, and maybe we would lose half of our congregations, which is not a good thing for unity. So when they are ready, it would most likely happen. But I would just, maybe if we have a chance to touch on this ethnic question, the second generation immigrants immediately wanted to assimilate when you look at all ethnic studies. And of course, English became immediately, and dropping many of the traditions and the heritage of the ethnic ways of doing things. But the third and fourth generation of people, which myself included, we seem to have more of an appreciation for wanting to know about our roots, about our ethnic background, about our ancestry, and preserving those traditions and heritage. And I think that for United Church of Christ as a whole, this is a healthy thing. It's not, to become a quote unquote Americanized English speaking mix without at all having any appreciation from where you come from or who you are. I think that younger people especially are really interested, because when you look at America, that's what America is. We're a country of ethnic groups brought together for many, many different reasons that have become something special. And to preserve that and preserve where you came from and what your struggles and history is, to share with other groups who are coming today from all parts of the world to be part of this American experience. To me, that's what what it's all about. And there's no other place than in the church itself where these things are shared and lived as we go through a Christian journey also.
Thank you, James. And that's one thing's for sure, you're correct. It's we are a country, a nation of immigrants. And Victor, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would like to add, that was great what Jim said, and I would like to add a few things. So your question was about theology, and of course Calvin Synod is a conservative synod, so our theology is conservative. But that theology actually does not define us. It's our Hungarian Reformed Church. Both of them are important for us. So for example, a few decades ago when certain liberal turns happened in the United Church of Christ, for a while it was a kind of danger that other conservative thinking people or members of the United Church of Christ would join to the Calvin Synod because we are conservative. But we said then, and we are saying even today, that conservatism is not defining us. So we don't want to have conservative people just to came to the Calvin Synod and maybe in a huge number and then overtake the whole thing. Because for us, the Hungarian roots are as much important as our theological roots. So there is no danger there. It's not that we are defined by our theology. We are defined by our history. And it's great what Jim said, that this is, although I am an immigrant, so I came here, but that's my experience also, that third, fourth, and sometimes fifth generation Hungarians thinks about the Hungarian roots even more warmly. It is more important for them to keep those connections, and that's something when we can help to, like for example, to the UCC. Like there is a war right now in Ukraine. There are a lot of refugees. Unfortunately, it's a tragical situation. We have insights because of our history. We are right there. We sometimes we know more what's happening there than what you can see on BBC or CNN. And for example, when the Syrian crisis happened, and unfortunately the Hungarian government was against refugees or supporting refugees from Syria, the Hungarian Reformed Church was so much about helping those people. And because of the Calvin Synod, we have a connection. The UCC have a connection with the Hungarian Reformed Church and was able to work together. I don't have information right now because the situation just falling out, but I can imagine that even today we can help for the UCC. We can be a channel for the UCC to whatever aid is needed there to make sure that it is actually arriving into the right place for the right people. I had questions in the past few days. We already started to collect money, and the first question is, so how are you making sure that the money is going into the right place? And we have the connection. We know the people who are going to deliver that money or that aid to those who need it. So what I am trying to say is that, again, our theology is not defining us. It is very important for us. We are not going to give up our theology. It is important, but this is not something with which we are defined by. The Hungarian roots, the connections, the ethnicity is as much important as the theology.
Thank you for saying that, both James and Jim and Victor, because in my working with ethnic identified and congregations of color, that's a common theme. The common theme that even congregations that's been part in the United States for over 100 years, Chinese, Japanese, Hawaiian identified, many of our native indigenous and our Latinx, Armenian congregations, is a similar story. The importance of their ethnicity, within their spirituality. So I thank you both. I really do. I thank you both for giving us your time and sharing us about the wonderful partnership that Calvin Synod has with all of the conferences in the United Church of Christ. And on behalf of the United Church of Christ, I thank you so much for being in conversation with us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And now we get to continue the conversation live. So again, Reverend Viktor and Elder Jim, now that you've heard it, this recording, some reflections, reflecting back on our conversation.
Yeah, I need to correct myself two times. Of course, our tradition is not 5,000 years old, it's only 500 years old. And somebody pointed out in the chat room that even in Hungary, the bishops are not elected for a lifetime. So I wasn't correct there. I became Hungarian Reformed in America. I was actually born and raised in a secular family, and I chose to be a Christian when I was adult. So my knowledge about the Hungarian Reformed Church in Hungary is not as good as others who were born and raised in that tradition.
That's all good. That's all good. I make mistakes all the time myself. So how are you doing, Elder James?
Good. And it was quite interesting to see that and hear that discussion that we had. And one of the things I wanted to add that came to mind after we had that discussion, which I think is very important, is that Calvin Synod churches are no different than any other mainline church in United Church of Christ. We all have our ups and our downs, and by and large, we always have to weigh both sides of an issue. When we have an issue, we have a healthy debate, and we come to some sort of an agreement. Not everybody is always happy, but as in rules of order and many ways in the church, once we reach a decision, it's up to membership and everyone to get behind it and do it. But in that respect, we are no different than other United Church of Christ, Protestant churches in general. We have ultra conservative, we have liberal ones. There's a whole spectrum, even within our small Calvin Synod of congregations, and many issues are debated quite vigorously before we end up with a decision. And I'm sure other conferences have the same situation and the same process that they go through.
Right. I mean, in our earlier conversation, it struck me that sometimes some of these votes are close.
So you wouldn't imagine that one of our last big conversation, which lasted for 2 days in our gathering, we have a gathering for all of the churches in every 2 years, was to join or not to join to the Hungarian Reformed churches. There is a conference there for all of the Hungarian Reformed churches in the Carpathian Basin. And you would think that it would be like a 100% yes, but we had the biggest debate on that. And after that, we decided to join. Of course, with conversation with the leaders of the UCC, so they are very pleased about it. But yeah, we have debates all the time.
And I could tell you that when you look back at the historical minutes of our synod, when we actually became part of the United Church of Christ, when it was formed, and we formed the Constitution and bylaws, as you know, our name was the Magyar Synod. And at that time, it was changed to the Calvin Synod. And if you look back, that vote itself too, and that debate about what the name should be was a very difficult time. I was not there present, but you could read it in the minutes. And there were several other proposals for that name. And if I'm not mistaken, it was only 1 or 2 votes that determined the name of Calvin Synod. But that's now where we are. So, you make the decision and then you embrace it, and everyone goes through that process.
Absolutely. So I noticed that there's a question in the chat about how many congregations currently make up the Calvin Synod.
So on paper, we have 22 congregations, but we are currently working on reopening churches. I mentioned in the interview, which was recorded, that our current bishop puts a lot of emphasis on visiting neighborhoods or churches, because the buildings are still there. So they just need help, and we are trying to reorganize churches. But currently, the number is 22.
Okay, so there's this movement to revitalize or to restart new works.
And I just remembered, I need to add this. There are actually 2 Hungarian Reformed bodies in the United States of America. There is another one, which is an independent Hungarian Reformed church. And they have churches both in the US and in Canada. And we are working very close to them. So with them, I would say it's like 40, 50 churches.
Which you're in relationship with as well. Okay, good. So, knowing that the United Church of Christ, we are a wide spectrum, in our denomination, and we have various affiliated type of ministries. And in my work, I work with the Coalition, the Collaboration of Immigrants and Refugees, the Council on Racial and Ethnic Ministries, the Open and Affirming Coalition of Open Affirming, and there is a movement called the Welcome, Faithful and Welcoming, which I understand that you have a seat on the board. And the Faithful and Welcoming talks about being a gathering of United Church of Christ congregations that seek to be evangelical, conservative, orthodox, and traditional. So what does that, in a Calvin Synod context, what does that mean?
So currently I am the board member from Calvin Synod at the Faithful and Welcoming Churches. And I would say that the main reason of the Faithful and Welcoming Churches to give a reason for evangelical, conservative, traditional churches and Christians not to leave the UCC, because there are still of us who are more conservative. So ECOT is trying to find a wide perspective within a more conservative theological thinking and give people reason to not to leave the UCC. Also, we are helping for churches who are in different conferences, finding pastors. If they would like to have a pastor who is more conservative, then we are trying to negotiate with that. So again, I would like to say and emphasize that the Faithful and Welcoming Church is not against something. It is for something. It is, giving this color or keeping this color in the United Church of Christ. And I would say that Calvin Synod fits into the picture when it comes to, so ECOT is evangelical, conservative. We are definitely more conservative. We are on the more conservative side. We are traditional in the sense that we are trying to keep our ethnic-based traditions. And Orthodoxy comes into the picture, not like the Orthodox Church, but to keep the historical Christian faith, which in Calvin Synod's case means that the first 4 ecumenical synods, from like 200 AD until 480. So the first 4 ecumenical synods, according to our belief, that they laid down the basic classical or Orthodox Christian dogmas. And so this is how we fit. We still believe that those are the dogmas we should keep in our hearts.
Got it. And Elder Jim, as an elder in the United Church of Christ of Bridgeport, you have indeed a relationship with the United Congregational Church of Bridgeport, which is an open and affirming congregation, but generally, what's the relationship been like, or the partnership?
Roberto, we have a very good relationship. They, as you know, they are renting our Bessemer Center Hall, which is next door to our church. The dream always for that center was that it would be not only just a parish hall, but that it has Sunday school rooms, it has offices, it has a second floor that's basically unfinished even to this day. When our congregation built that back in the 1970s, we ran out of funds, so we never finished the second floor. It was always used for the past 50 years as our fundraising tag sale room that we had, and we've basically are in the process of cleaning that out. But the whole idea was to make that a center of activity, and United Congregational is doing that in that building. They have, not only do they have their worship service there, but they have many programs through their Nourish, Bridgeport, and other community-based programs that they are doing throughout that building. So as we go forward, I could see that being a hub that we welcome the opportunity to work with them in the future to do those things with, in the community that serves the community of Bridgeport.
That's pretty awesome. And I'm thinking also, I had the privilege of visiting your congregation out in Bridgeport. What fascinated me was the museum room, the historical room. Can you share a little bit about how that came about and the richness of documents that you have of both, the church in the U.S. and in relationship with the United Church of Christ?
Yes, that was a dream of several of our past members, and we finally were able to put it together because we do have a rich history, and we have not only documents but memorabilia, and all going back to our founding from 1904 in Bridgeport, but also information from the Reformed Church in Hungary. Many of the documents we have are in Hungarian language, and we have original documents from the founding of our church and our founding members. And to try and put it together in a little room that we have that people can actually access it is very important, because many people want to know and see these items. And so it's still a work in progress. It's always there's always something to be done with it, but we've started putting it together. And I would encourage every church to take, many places, as was in ours, they're sitting in a box or in a closet or somewhere, in a storage room. And these things, a lot of people, especially today, are very much interested in the history and of how your church came about. And you find also little tidbits of information of the members and what their families and the weddings, the first wedding that happened in your church, and the first baptism that happened. And it's a really historical treasures of the congregation, that and it's important as we go forward to keep putting this stuff together, and so because people are very much interested in it today, especially.
Definitely coming from a heritage where we honor our ancestors and ancestry, you could feel walking into that space, you could feel the presence and the care and the love that you all did to showcase the history of your congregation, the history of the Hungarian people, the Magyar people, and feel the presence. So and that's very common in many of our ethnic identified congregations and congregations of color. We're honoring our ancestry and our ancestors. It's a huge part of our ministries and presence. So I want to thank you both so much for being with us today, for sharing and letting those of us know a little bit better about the Calvin Synod, and I look forward to continuing working with you all. So, any last words, Elder Jim?
I would just thank you for giving us the opportunity to share our experiences about Calvin Synod. I think, like I said in the initial interview we had, ethnic churches should be proud of their ethnicity, but we all need to remember who we are, and that number one, we're the Church of Jesus Christ. We're Christians. That's our mission. That's what we want our churches to do. But there's nothing wrong with doing it with a little Hungarian food on the side. But we, don't lose track of who we are. We need to be part of the United Church of Christ, the worldwide churches, the Reformed Church in Hungary, because we all have a mission to make it a better world and a better place with our Christian values.
Well said, Elder Jim. And so, Reverend Victor, why don't you give us your closing thoughts and close us up with the benediction?
Well, I also would like to thank you to give us the opportunity to introduce ourselves. So it was fun. Thank you. Let us pray. Creator God, we are so thankful that we have these opportunities to share. We are thankful that we live in a society where we actually historically learn that different ethnic groups can not just live next to each other, but also share our thoughts and our roots. And thank you so much that you give us peace, and we acknowledge that we are so privileged in the United States of America to have these kind of opportunities and to have peace and to have enough to eat and enough to drink. And we acknowledge that there is a lot of trouble all around the world. And in your word, you said that to whom much is given, much is required. So today I pray, please help us to see those places where our help is required. Please help us to be wise with all of the things you have given to us, and help us to be able to spread the good news, your gospel. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Dear friends in Christ, if this conversation has moved you, if what's been offered here has enhanced your ministry or healed your soul in any way, please consider donating to support the annual fund of the United Church of Christ. Simply text UCC to 41444. Your support will help build more programs like this. We thank you for your support. Be blessed and be a blessing, and know that you are not alone. We are holding you in prayer. Amen.